So in this part 2 video, we'll look at the execution of the model, and then I'll briefly show an updated model that uses some of the new features that were added in Sprint 83. So recall that the situation we have is that we have entities that arrive to a server. They go randomly to server 1 or server 2, and during the server process they also need access to one of the resources, one of the operators, and one operator works first shift, second operator works second shift, and the behavior that we want is if a operator is working and is scheduled to go off shift, we want that server process to be suspended, the operator released, and then sees back the next operator. And so we implemented that using the add-on process for operator off shift, and we went through this in the previous video. So let's watch and see how this works. So if I run the model and let it run until time 8, recall we have the notify step, which will generate a warning to tell us that the operator is about to go off shift. And so what I'm going to do here, we looked at this before, I'm going to pause the simulation, and then I'm going to open up model trace so that we can trace the execution. So here we are at time 8, and you can see that the operator first R is red, meaning that he is off shift, and the entity is red. So we have already executed the assignment to set the picture, and we've released the operator. So if we just hit the F6 to step through what happens, you can see that the capacity for the second resource has changed because it's come on shift, and we are processing that, allocating the capacity, and so you can see that the second operator has been the second operator's capacity has been allocated to part 22, and then if we continue, we will then execute the assign step that will assign the entity picture back to green. So here we are still at time 9. So recall that operator 2 starts shift at time 9, and it has taken over the process on server 2. So if we continue to step, we can see that the resume step has occurred, and now the number of suspensions applied to the process is 0, and so we have resumed the process. So we click run again, and this time we'll run until we hit that notify again, and that's going to happen when operator 2 goes off shift, which should happen at time 16. So here we are at time 16, and you can see that the second shift operator is processing part 26. First shift operator is off shift, and so now the second shift operator is ready to go off shift. So again, we can click on the pause the simulation, and we can sort of step through the process of what's going on. And so now here we are at time 17.5 when the next entity arrived, and our resources, neither one of our operators will come back on until time 24. So nothing interesting happens with regard to the operator. One thing to note is that the entity that's being processed by server 1 is red, so it's still in this state of waiting for the operator, and the process is in a state of suspension. So I'm going to click run here and let it run, and I'm going to try to stop it close to time 24. 20, let's see, 21, 22, 23, let's stop it right there. So here we are at time 23.48. So when I now go into step mode, so hit F6, and now it's time 2024, and first our operator has now come back on, and we can step through and see that first operator picks up service or is allocated to part 26, and then the suspensions, the resume step, will then resume processing. So at this point the model appears to behave as we expect. And so just to recap, there are a couple of key points about this model that we want to keep in mind. First of all, what we needed to know is when the operator goes off shift, we have to do something. And so we used an add-on process for the resource when the operator went off shift. So that's the first key thing, is knowing when we needed to do something. The second thing we needed to do here is, in that add-on process, we needed to change the context of the token. In other words, the token was created with the associated object being the resource. In order to to release and then seize back that resource, we needed to have the context of the entity, and so we used the search step to actually change the context of or create a new token with the context specified by resource.capacity.current_owners.first_item. And finally, the third thing that we needed to do is we needed to know which process to suspend, and then to record this process in the context of the model entity. And so we added a process reference state variable, so that when we got to the add-on process and we were in the context of the entity, we would have access to that process that needed to be suspended and resumed. One final thing I want to illustrate with this model is, if you happen to have Simio Enterprise, we can look at this model in the Planning tab, and we can actually see where the resources, the first hour and second hour, are handing off. And so we're going to look at the resource plan, which shows the resource view, and you can see here on Monday, let's see, right here is when the changeover happened. So we start at time 8, and the first operator gets off at 4, which is shown as 16 here. And we can see that part 22 was on server 1 just briefly right before resource 1 went off shift, and so there was the 1 hour delay here because operator 2 comes on at time 5, and so we can see that part 22 shifted from operator 1 to operator 2. Similarly, if we go down to where operator 2 gets off, we can see that happening right here. Operator 2 gets off at midnight, and so let's see, this is part 25, arrived somewhere around 11, processed for 1 hour, then remained on server 1 throughout the third shift when there are no operators, and then when the first operator arrived at time 8, the process resumed and finished the remaining processing hour. So I mentioned in the previous video that this version of the model is for pre-Sprint 83 versions of Simio, and so I want to talk for just a couple of seconds about what would be different. So in this model, the process, when the operator goes off shift, recall we have the need to create a token whose associated object is the entity that's holding the resource, and we needed to do that so that we could release the resource here and seize the resource here once the operator came, or the next operator came on shift. And so we needed a reference, or we needed the context of that entity to be able to do the seize and release steps. In Sprint 83, some changes have been made that make that now not necessary. So here's the version that will work in Sprint 83, and the major difference is this off-shift process, and you can see there's no search step, because essentially we have modified the release and seize steps so that we can release the owner. We can specify a specific object as the owner type. So instead of creating a token in the context of that entity, what we're going to do is just create a reference to that entity. And so to do that, we're going to use a custom token. So we went to the model definitions and created a custom token, and with that token we added an object reference state variable called entity reference. And so when the operator goes off shift, we are going to first of all make sure that the resource is being used. So we're going to look at the current owner's number items, and if that's greater than 0, then we're simply going to assign the first item in the current owners list to that entity reference state in the token. And so when we come out of this assign step, the token has a reference to the entity. We can use that reference to release from the specific object here, and to seize for the specific object here. Note that we had to store the item in a state, because once we release the resource, we no longer have access through that capacity.currentOwners.firstItem. So you can see by adding these two, by updating the season release, we no longer have to search to create a token in the context of the entity to do the season release. And that's the only change that we have in the models between pre-Sprint 83 and Sprint 83.